Picture, if you will, a limestone palace rising from the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, its 56 rooms filled with what should have been the sounds of triumph, the laughter of a man who revolutionized the world, the quiet satisfaction of his devoted wife, the hum of their own hydroelectric power plant churning beneath manicured gardens designed by the era's most celebrated landscape architect, and yet, stand here long enough in the silence of what remains, peer through the windows now finally being restored after decades of abandonment and institutional neglect, and you begin to understand that Fair Lane was never really about celebration at all, but about something far more haunting, the desperate, exhausting, ultimately futile attempt of Henry Ford to build a fortress against his own contradictions, to create through Indiana limestone and concrete and the labor of hundreds of invisible hands a monument that would prove he was something other than what he actually was, which is to say a man of staggering genius and appalling cruelty, a revolutionary who despised revolution, a son of farmers who became an industrial titan yet never stopped resenting the very workers whose sweat made his fortune possible, and whose 31,000 square foot estate, conceived in 1913 and completed in 1915 at the height of his power when the Model T had already transformed American life and the moving assembly line had forever altered the relationship between human beings and the machines they operated, would become in the end not a testament to success but a monument to the price of that success, a price paid not primarily by Ford himself, who died here in 1947 during a flood with only his wife Clara beside him, their only son Edsel already 3 years dead at 49 from stomach cancer that some whispered was hastened by his father's relentless psychological torment, but paid by the thousands of workers whose names we'll never know, the servants who maintained the illusion of pastoral perfection, the union organizers beaten bloody outside the River Rouge plant, the hungry marchers shot down in 1932 when they dared to ask for work, and the Jewish communities Ford's newspaper the Dearborn Independent vilified for nearly a decade in articles so venomous that Adolf Hitler kept Ford's portrait on his wall and cited him as an inspiration, all of which raises the question that hangs over Fair Lane like the morning mist that still rises from the Rouge. What does it mean when the machine that was supposed to liberate humanity, the affordable automobile, the moving assembly line, the $5 day that Ford trumpeted as profit-sharing, becomes instead another mechanism of control? And what happens to the palace built by such a man when the man himself is gone and the world he tried to dominate through innovation and intimidation begins to reckon with his legacy? What happens when the walls begin to crack and the roof begins to leak and the gardens grow wild and the powerhouse falls silent and the university that inherited this burden treats it with benign neglect for half a century until finally, someone asks whether we have the courage to tell the whole story, the dark story, the story that American capitalism has spent 100 years trying not to tell about wealth and power and the human cost of progress and whether any amount of innovation justifies the suffering required to achieve it. The story begins, as so many American stories do, with ambition born of humble origins and shaped by the particular alchemy of 19th-century Michigan, that strange wilderness industrial hybrid where farms bordered factories and the sons of immigrants could dream of transforming the world. Henry Ford, born July 30, 1863, on a farm in Springwells Township, Michigan, to William Ford, an Irish immigrant who had fled the potato famine in 1847, arriving in America with nothing but determination, and eventually establishing himself as a respected farmer in the Michigan countryside, and Mary Lydigot Ford, whose own family had emigrated from Belgium, bringing with them the practical skills and Protestant work ethic that would characterize their descendants, a boy who from his earliest memories felt trapped by agricultural life, who watched his father labor in fields that demanded everything and gave back barely enough, who saw his mother work herself to exhaustion managing a household without modern conveniences, bearing children, preserving food, making clothes, doing the endless tasks that farm life required, and who lost that mother when he was just 12 years old, her death in childbirth leaving a wound that Henry Ford would carry for the rest of his life, a wound that perhaps explains some of his later obsessions with control and preservation and his determination to build a world where he could protect what mattered to him, where loss couldn't touch him the way his mother's death had touched him, where he could use wealth and power as shields against the randomness and cruelty of fate. Young Henry attended a one-room schoolhouse where he displayed neither particular academic brilliance nor any interest in book learning. He would later claim he'd never read a book all the way through, a boast that revealed both his anti-intellectualism and his insecurity about his lack of formal education, but who, when given a watch to repair at age 13, discovered in himself an almost supernatural aptitude for understanding mechanical systems, for seeing how gears and springs and levers work together, for taking apart and reassembling machinery until he understood it so completely that he could improve upon it, a gift that seemed to come from nowhere, that couldn't be explained by his family background or his schooling, that was simply there, innate, the way musical genius is innate in some people or mathematical ability in others, and this gift became Henry Ford's escape route from a life he despised, his ticket away from the farm and the endless cycle of planting and harvesting and barely surviving that had killed his mother and was slowly killing his father, his proof that he was meant for something different, something bigger, something that would let him impose his will on the world rather than submit to the world's indifferent forces. At 15, Ford was walking to Detroit, 8 miles each way, just to see the machines in shop windows, to watch steam engines and manufacturing equipment, to absorb everything he could about how things worked, and at 16, against his father's wishes and warnings, he left the farm entirely, moved to Detroit, took a job as a machinist's apprentice at James F. Flower & Brothers earning $2.50 a week, a wage so low that he had to take a second job repairing watches at night just to afford room and board in a cheap boarding house, eating minimal food, living in a city that was in 1879 still rough and industrial and divided sharply between the wealthy merchants and factory owners who lived in elegant homes along Woodward Avenue and the workers who crowded into boarding houses and tenements in neighborhoods like Corktown, where Irish immigrants packed into small spaces and worked brutal hours and died young from industrial accidents or disease or simple exhaustion, all of which gave young Henry Ford an education not just in machinery but in class, in the reality that some men owned the means of production and most men sold their labor to those owners for whatever wages the owners chose to pay, in the visible fact that America was not actually a classless democracy where hard work guaranteed success but rather a stratified society where birth and luck and ruthlessness mattered as much as ability, a lesson he learned thoroughly but interpreted in his own peculiar way. Deciding not that the system was unjust and should be changed but that he personally would be one of the owners, that his mechanical genius would lift him from the working class into the owning class, that he would become one of the men who built machines rather than one of the men who served them, never apparently considering that this zero-sum interpretation meant someone else would have to remain in the working class, would have to serve the machines he built, would have to live the life he was so desperate to escape. Ford spent the next several years moving between jobs, working as a machinist, then returning briefly to the farm to help his father, then working for the Westinghouse Company servicing steam engines across southern Michigan, gaining experience with different types of machinery, learning the practical engineering that no school could teach, and somewhere during this period, he heard about the internal combustion engine, a newfangled device that European inventors were experimenting with, that used controlled explosions of gasoline vapor to drive pistons, that might someday power vehicles without the need for external fuel sources like coal or wood, and this idea captured Ford's imagination completely, the notion that you could build a self-contained machine that carried its own fuel and could go anywhere without needing to stop at water stations like steam engines or recharging stations like electric motors, a machine that would give individuals unprecedented mobility and freedom. And once this idea took hold of Henry Ford, he pursued it with the obsessive focus that would characterize everything he did, the absolute refusal to be diverted or discouraged, the willingness to sacrifice everything else, comfort, security, social approval, even common sense, to achieve his vision, a quality that was simultaneously his greatest strength and most dangerous flaw. By 1888, Henry Ford had returned to the Detroit area, was working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company earning $45 a month, a decent wage that provided security and respect, the kind of steady job that most men of his background would have been grateful to keep for life, but Ford wasn't most men, wasn't content with security when he could pursue glory, wasn't willing to remain an employee when he could become an owner, and on April 11, 1888, her 22nd birthday, he married Clara Jane Bryant in a ceremony at her parents' home in Greenfield Township, Clara who was a farmer's daughter, dark-haired and practical and possessed of a quiet strength that would prove essential to everything Ford accomplished, who believed in Henry with an intensity that bordered on religious faith, who never doubted that her peculiar husband with his obsessive focus on machinery and his social awkwardness and his barely suppressed rage at having been born poor would somehow, some way, accomplish something extraordinary, even though what exactly that something might be remained unclear through the early years of their marriage when they lived in a rental house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit, and Henry worked his Edison job during the day while spending every spare moment in a brick shed behind the house, working on what he called a gasoline carriage, a contraption that most people thought was a waste of time because after all, everyone knew that if self-propelled vehicles ever became practical they'd be powered by electricity or steam, not explosive gasoline. Everyone knew this except Henry Ford, who had decided with characteristic stubbornness that internal combustion was the future and that he would be the one to make it work, and Clara, rather than complaining about the money he spent on parts or the time he spent in the shed or the fact that this obsession was making them poorer and delaying their ability to start a family, their only child, Edsel, wouldn't be born until 1893, instead encouraged him, believed in him, gave him the emotional support and practical help that made his experiments possible, even though she must have wondered sometimes whether she'd married a genius or a fool, whether this gasoline carriage would change their lives or ruin them. What Clara couldn't have known, what no one could have predicted in those early years when Henry Ford was just another mechanic with big dreams, was that her husband's obsession would indeed change their lives, would change the world, would make the name Ford synonymous with automobiles and modernity and American industrial might, but would also bring them into a realm of wealth and power and moral complexity that farm kids from rural Michigan could never have imagined, would force them to navigate questions about labor and race and religion and responsibility that they were utterly unprepared for, would transform them from ordinary people into American royalty with all the corruption and compromise and complicity that such transformation entails, would give them fair lane and everything it represented, beauty and comfort and security and power, but also burden them with everything fair lane's beauty concealed, exploitation and violence and hatred and blood. Ford built his first functioning gasoline engine in 1893, his first complete vehicle, the quadricycle, in 1896, driving it through Detroit streets at 2 in the morning because the noise would frighten horses during the day, famously having to knock down part of the shed's doorway to get it out because he'd built it too large to fit through the opening, a mistake that became part of the legend, proof of Ford's focus on the work rather than practical details, though it also revealed his tendency to ignore obvious problems until they became crises, a tendency that would plague him throughout his career, that would lead him to make brilliant innovations while simultaneously making catastrophic errors of judgment, to revolutionize manufacturing while brutalizing workers, to democratize transportation while spreading genocidal propaganda, to build fair lane as a sanctuary while creating a workplace culture of surveillance and violence that made sanctuary necessary. The meeting that changed everything happened at a convention in New York in 1896, where Ford, then an unknown engineer tinkering in his spare time, encountered Thomas Edison, already world famous as the inventor of the electric light, the phonograph, the motion picture camera, a man whose name was synonymous with genius and progress and the American dream of innovation rewarding talent, whose own poor background and limited formal education paralleled Ford's, who had risen through brilliance and determination and ruthless business practices to become both celebrated inventor and industrial titan, the embodiment of everything Ford wanted to be, and when Ford described his gasoline engine experiments, Edison, who was himself working on electric vehicles and therefore had every reason to dismiss a competitor's technology, instead banged his fist on the table and said, "Young man, that's the thing. You have it. Keep at it. Electric cars must keep near to power stations. The storage battery is too heavy. Steam cars won't do either, for they have to have a boiler and fire. Your car is self-contained, carries its own power plant, no fire, no boiler, no smoke and no steam. You have the thing. Keep at it," words that Ford never forgot, that he would repeat for the rest of his life as the moment when the great Edison validated his vision, that forged a friendship between the two men that would last until Edison's death and that reveals something essential about Ford's psychology. He needed external validation even as he projected absolute confidence, he needed father figures even as he rebelled against authority, he needed to be told he was right even when he was convinced he was right, and this need for validation combined with an inability to accept criticism created a personality that was simultaneously insecure and tyrannical, that craved approval from those he deemed superior while crushing anyone who dared question him, that could show remarkable loyalty and generosity to people like Edison while showing cruelty and contempt to workers and subordinates, That could be both the best and worst of American capitalism embodied in one increasingly contradictory person. The road from Edison's encouragement to the founding of Ford Motor Company on June 16, 1903, was neither straight nor simple, but rather a journey. Through failure and frustration that taught Ford lessons he would apply for the rest of his life, some of them valuable and some of them toxic, Ford's first attempt at an automobile company, the Detroit Automobile Company founded in 1899 with financial backing from Detroit's business elite, failed within 2 years because Ford obsessed over making the cars perfect rather than actually producing them for sale, because he had not yet learned that good enough on time beats perfect too late, that customers want cars they can buy today rather than promises of perfection tomorrow, that manufacturing is as much about processes and deadlines and meeting customer expectations as it is about engineering excellence, and his backers, frustrated with his refusal to listen to their advice or meet production targets, dissolved the company, leaving Ford with a reputation as a brilliant engineer but a poor businessman, someone who could build amazing prototypes but couldn't run a sustainable company. His second attempt, the Henry Ford Company founded in 1901, also failed, ending after just 4 months when Ford's financial backers, once again frustrated with his autocratic style and refusal to compromise, forced him out of his own company, which then reorganized without him and eventually became Cadillac under the leadership of Henry Leland. Meaning Ford had to watch other men succeed with a company that bore his name, had to witness Cadillac become synonymous with luxury automobiles while he remained a failed entrepreneur, and this humiliation, this experience of being forced out and replaced, taught Ford perhaps his most important and most destructive lesson, that if he was going to build automobiles his way, he needed absolute control, needed to structure things so that no one could overrule him, no board of directors could fire him. No investors could demand that he prioritize their profits over his vision, needed to own enough of the company that he could make every decision without needing approval or consensus, and this determination to maintain absolute control would shape not just Ford Motor Company's structure but Ford's entire approach to business and life, would lead him to buy out all other shareholders by 1919 to establish total family ownership, would make him simultaneously one of the most innovative and most autocratic industrialists in American history, would let him implement brilliant ideas that more conservative management would have blocked but would also let him implement terrible ideas that any reasonable board would have prevented, would make Ford Motor Company in some ways the most progressive employer in America and in other ways the most oppressive, would enable Fair Lane's construction as exactly the home Ford wanted without compromise but would also enable the Dearborn Independent's publication of hate without anyone inside the company having the authority to stop him. When Ford finally, on his third attempt, managed to found Ford Motor Company with 12 investors contributing a total of $28,000 in capital, Ford himself contributing mainly his expertise and his patents in exchange for 25.5% ownership, enough to be the largest shareholder and control company direction, he was 40 years old, had failed twice, was widely considered a brilliant eccentric who couldn't run a business, whose backers were taking a risk on someone who had proven better at building cars than selling them, and yet this third attempt succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, initially because Ford, having learned from his failures, finally found the right balance between his perfectionism and practical business needs, finally accepted that he needed to produce cars that were good enough rather than waiting until they were perfect, finally understood that customers wanted reliability and affordability more than cutting-edge innovation, and the cars Ford Motor Company produced in its early years, models A, B, C, F, K, N, R, and S, a bewildering alphabet soup that reflected Ford's continued experimentation, sold well enough to keep the company afloat and gradually build capital, but the real breakthrough came in 1908 with the introduction of the Model T, a vehicle that represented everything Ford had learned in 15 years of obsessive work, that embodied his philosophy of manufacturing more completely than any previous automobile, that was so brilliantly designed for its purpose and so revolutionary in its implications that it would literally change human civilization. The Model T, initially priced at $850 when most cars cost thousands, looked ungainly with its high chassis and plain black finish and complete lack of luxury features, looked like exactly what it was, a machine built for utility rather than status, for reliability rather than comfort, for affordability rather than prestige, and in an industry where automobiles had always been luxury items marketed to the wealthy, where car companies competed on elegance and speed and prestige, Ford's decision to build a deliberately plain, deliberately cheap, deliberately utilitarian vehicle seemed almost perverse, a rejection of everything the automobile market valued, except that Ford had understood something his competitors missed, that there was no mass market for $3,000 luxury vehicles but there could be an enormous market for $850 practical vehicles, that most Americans didn't want or need speed and elegance, they needed transportation that worked, that the vast middle class, farmers and small businessmen and skilled workers, would buy automobiles in huge numbers if automobiles became affordable and reliable enough to justify the expense, and the Model T, with its high clearance suitable for rutted rural roads, its simple design that made repairs possible without specialized tools or knowledge, its durable construction that meant it could survive years of hard use, was exactly the vehicle that market needed. And once that market discovered the Model T, sales exploded, 10,000 in the first year, 34,000 in 1910, 78,000 in 1912, 308,000 in 1914, numbers that overwhelmed Ford's manufacturing capacity, that created waiting lists of customers desperate to buy cars faster than Ford could build them, that turned the bottleneck from sales to production, and this problem of insufficient production capacity despite running factories at maximum capacity with traditional manufacturing methods, led Ford to his second great breakthrough, the one that would make him not just a successful businessman but a revolutionary figure in world history, the moving assembly line. The moving assembly line, introduced at Ford's Highland Park plant in 1913, was not invented by Henry Ford. He borrowed the concept from meat-packing plants where animal carcasses moved on overhead rails past workers who each performed one specialized task, but Ford's application of the principle to automobile manufacturing, and his systematic development of the concept until it reached maximum efficiency, transformed not just automobile production but the entire nature of industrial work, and the transformation was staggering. Before the assembly line, skilled craftsmen built each car from start to finish, a process that required extensive training and took approximately 12 hours per vehicle, but with the assembly line, where each worker performed one simple, repetitive task as partially assembled cars moved past their station on a conveyor belt, the time required to build a Model T dropped to 93 minutes, an efficiency gain so enormous that it seemed almost magical. That let Ford increase production exponentially while actually reducing labor costs per vehicle, that made the Model T cheaper every year even as Ford paid workers more, that created a virtuous cycle where lower prices expanded the market which increased production which reduced per unit costs which allowed even lower prices which expanded the market further. A cycle that made Ford unimaginably wealthy while making automobiles genuinely affordable to ordinary Americans, making Ford Motor Company simultaneously the most profitable and most customer-friendly major corporation in America, making Henry Ford a folk hero celebrated as the man who gave America wheels, but the assembly line also transformed workers from craftsmen into what they would later call themselves, in bitter recognition of their dehumanization, machine tenders, people who performed the same motion thousands of times per day with no variation, no creativity, no autonomy, no connection to the final product, who became appendages of the machinery rather than masters of it, whose work was so physically demanding, standing in one spot for hours, reaching and turning and lifting with mechanical precision, and so psychologically deadening, the absolute monotony of repetition without meaning, that Ford's annual worker turnover exceeded 370% in 1913, meaning Ford had to hire more than 52,000 workers just to maintain a workforce of 14,000, meaning workers were voting with their feet against the modern miracle of mass production, choosing unemployment over the soul-crushing experience of assembly line work, and this crisis threatened to undermine the entire system, threatened to make the assembly line unworkable if Ford couldn't maintain stable workforce levels, which led him to the radical decision announced on January 5, 1914, that would transform his reputation and obscure the reality of assembly line work for generations. The $5 day. The announcement of the $5 day created a sensation. Ford Motor Company would begin paying a minimum wage of $5 per day for an 8-hour workday, more than double the previous wage of $2.34 for a 9-hour day, and the news sparked celebrations among workers, sparked outrage among other industrialists who accused Ford of being a socialist or a madman or both, sparked enormous publicity that made Ford even more famous, that transformed him in the public imagination from mere businessmen to enlightened industrial statesmen, to proof that capitalism and worker welfare could coexist, that a major industrialist could be generous to workers while still making huge profits, and 10,000 men showed up at Ford's Highland Park plant hoping for jobs, creating such a mob that police had to use fire hoses to disperse the crowd on a freezing January morning. But here's what the celebratory narrative conveniently omits, what contemporary accounts mentioned but later hagiographies forgot. The $5 day wasn't actually $5, it was a complicated profit-sharing arrangement where the base wage remained around $2.50 and workers could earn up to an additional $2.50 if they met Ford standards for appropriate living, standards that were investigated and enforced by the Sociological Department, a corporate apparatus that employed 50 investigators whose job was to enter workers' homes unannounced, to inspect their living conditions for cleanliness and order, to interview their wives about household management and spending habits, to verify that they didn't drink alcohol or gamble or take in boarders or send money to relatives overseas, to check their bank accounts to ensure they were saving appropriately, to determine whether immigrant workers were attending Ford English school and properly Americanizing, learning not just English but the proper way to dress and eat and behave, graduating in ceremonies where they entered a large melting pot in their native dress and emerged in identical American suits waving American flags, and only workers who passed these investigations received the full $5 day, meaning Ford had found a way to extend his control far beyond the factory floor into the most intimate details of workers' private lives, to make his financial generosity conditional on cultural conformity and moral compliance as he defined it, to turn higher wages into a tool of surveillance and social engineering. That was in some ways more invasive and controlling than simply paying low wages and leaving workers alone, except that it worked. Ford's turnover problem disappeared. Workers accepted the surveillance because $5 a day, even with conditions, was better than anything else available, because they could buy homes and support families and build savings on those wages in ways that had been impossible before, because for all its invasiveness, the $5 day genuinely raised living standards and created economic security for tens of thousands of families. And this is what makes Ford's legacy so impossible to simplify. His paternalism was oppressive and his surveillance was intrusive and his assumption that he had the right to judge workers' private lives was outrageous and his profit sharing was explicitly designed to prevent unionization by making workers dependent on his approval, and yet, thousands of families lived better because of Ford's wages, thousands of men could afford homes because of Ford's pay structure. The American middle class grew substantially because of Ford's wage policy, and if we condemn the surveillance while celebrating the economic outcomes, or celebrate the economic outcomes while ignoring the surveillance, we miss the essential point that they were the same thing, that Ford's version of enlightened capitalism was simultaneously progressive and authoritarian, generous and controlling, genuinely beneficial and deeply problematic, just like Fair Lane would be simultaneously a beautiful home and a monument to exploitation, simultaneously a sanctuary and a symbol of everything wrong with concentrated wealth. This was the man, this was the fortune, this was the context in which Fair Lane was conceived in 1913, at the exact moment when Ford's genius for production and his genius for control were converging into something unprecedented, when he had more money than he'd ever imagined possible. By 1914 Ford's personal wealth exceeded $40 million and was growing exponentially, and more power over more lives than any medieval lord, when he was celebrated as an American hero for democratizing transportation and revolutionizing manufacturing, but also beginning to reveal the darker aspects of his personality that success had amplified rather than mellowed, the paranoia that made him see conspiracies everywhere, the conviction that he was always right and everyone who disagreed was either stupid or corrupt, the need to dominate every situation and relationship, the inability to tolerate dissent or criticism, the growing eccentricity that made him believe his genius in manufacturing qualified him to have strong opinions about nutrition and education and history and international relations despite having no expertise in any of those areas, the festering resentments against banks and lawyers and intellectuals and Jews who he increasingly blamed for problems he couldn't control, and it was at this moment, this peak of success before the darkest revelations, that Ford decided he needed a proper estate, not because he cared about impressing other rich people. Ford genuinely despised the ostentatious consumption of Gilded Age aristocrats with their Newport mansions and their European affectations, criticized them publicly as wasteful and decadent, but because he needed to create a physical space that matched his self-image, successful but not pretentious, modern but connected to nature, powerful but somehow still authentically American and rural and simple, a paradox that could only be resolved through enormous expenditure made to look effortless, which is to say that Fair Lane would be that most American of contradictions, a monument to unpretentious magnificence, rustic grandeur, common man luxury, a place where a man who proclaimed his hatred of ostentation could live in a 31,000 square foot mansion on 1,300 acres and still think of himself as just a simple farm boy. The site Ford chose held personal significance, over 1,300 acres along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, near where both he and Clara had grown up, near the farm where his father still lived, land that Ford had been quietly purchasing since 1907, assembling a patchwork of properties into a unified estate that would give him privacy and space and control over his environment, that would let him create a miniature world run according to his specifications where he wouldn't have to see or deal with anything that disturbed his vision of how things should be. And here already we see the pattern that would define Fair Lane. Ford presented it as a return to his roots, a successful man coming home to the land of his childhood, but the reality was that he was transforming that land beyond recognition, buying out his neighbors to create empty space around himself, damming the Rouge River to generate his own electricity, importing thousands of plants from across the country, bringing in hundreds of tons of stone, employing hundreds of workers for years to build something that would look natural, but was actually as artificial and manufactured as any factory. And this contradiction, between the reality of massive construction and engineering and the appearance of organic natural simplicity, would characterize every aspect of Fair Lane, from Jens Jensen's supposedly wild landscape that required constant maintenance, to the powerhouse designed to look like a carriage house, to Ford's own self-presentation as a humble man who happened to live in a palace, to the entire American myth that great fortunes are earned through individual merit rather than extracted through exploitation of labor. Ford hired William H. Van Tyne, a prominent Pittsburgh architect, to design the main house, but the relationship quickly soured because Van Tyne had the audacity to believe that as the architect he should make design decisions, that his professional expertise qualified him to determine things like room layouts and architectural details, not understanding that Henry Ford didn't hire people to make decisions. He hired them to execute his decisions, that Ford's need for absolute control extended to every aspect of his life including the design of his own home, and when Van Tyne proved insufficiently willing to simply do what he was told, Ford fired him and brought in Marion Mahoney Griffin, who had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright and understood the prairie school aesthetic that Ford found appealing. That emphasis on horizontal lines and natural materials and integration with the landscape that seemed authentically American rather than derivative of European styles, but Griffin too discovered that working for Ford meant constant interference and second-guessing, meant that Ford would approve plans and then change his mind, would insist on specific features and then reject them when completed, would demand explanations and then dismiss the explanations as overcomplicated expert nonsense, and the result was a design process that dragged on for years, that involved multiple architects and countless revisions, that cost far more than originally projected, that produced a house whose final form satisfied Ford but reflected his inability to trust anyone else's judgment, his conviction that only he understood what was right, his need to control every detail even when he lacked the expertise to make informed decisions, qualities that made him a revolutionary industrialist and an impossible employer, a visionary and a tyrant, a man who could see what others couldn't but who also couldn't see his own limitations. The house that finally emerged from this tortured process was a sprawling 56-room mansion built primarily of Indiana limestone, its architecture an eclectic mix that defied easy categorization, combining prairie school influences with arts and crafts elements and touches of Scottish baronial style that reflected Clara's ancestry, a house that was simultaneously imposing and intimate, grand and comfortable, filled with the latest technological conveniences, central heating, electricity, telephones, an early form of air conditioning, but decorated with handcrafted furniture and natural materials that created an atmosphere of rustic simplicity, or rather the expensive illusion of rustic simplicity. Because every beam that looked hand-hewn had actually been carefully selected and finished by craftsmen, every stone that appeared naturally placed had been precisely positioned by masons, every detail that seemed effortlessly authentic had been laboriously constructed to create that impression, and this was the fundamental dishonesty at Fair Lane's heart, not that it was luxurious. Many houses were luxurious, but that it pretended not to be, that it presented wealth as modesty, extravagance as simplicity, enormous privilege as common man authenticity, allowing Ford to live in unprecedented comfort while maintaining his self-image as just a regular fellow who happened to have money, allowing visitors to marvel at the house's beauty while Ford deflected compliments by pointing out how practical and unpretentious everything was, how the design emphasized function over form and natural materials over ostentation, as if choosing expensive materials to look simple was somehow more virtuous than choosing expensive materials to look expensive, as if the hundreds of workers who built Fair Lane and the dozens of servants who maintained it were invisible, as if wealth itself could be made morally neutral through aesthetic choices. The grounds, designed by Jens Jensen, the legendary landscape architect who pioneered the use of native plants and naturalistic design, covered over 1,300 acres of rolling terrain along the Rouge River, with formal gardens near the house gradually transitioning to meadows and woodlands that were supposed to evoke the Michigan landscape before European settlement, supposed to represent a return to natural authenticity after centuries of agricultural and industrial transformation. Except that creating a natural landscape required massive intervention, moving thousands of tons of earth to create the desired topography, planting thousands of trees and shrubs sourced from across the country, installing elaborate drainage and irrigation systems to maintain plant health, building miles of paths and roads that appeared to follow natural contours but were actually carefully engineered, damming the Rouge River to create a picturesque waterfall and to power the estate's electrical generator, employing a staff of gardeners who worked constantly to maintain the illusion of wild spontaneity, removing any plants that grew where they weren't wanted, trimming and shaping and controlling nature until it matched Jensen's and Ford's vision of what nature should look like, and the irony, the staggering, almost comic irony, is that Ford, who had spent his youth desperate to escape farm labor, who had devoted his genius to creating machines that would free humans from agricultural drudgery, who had built a fortune on urban industrial production, now employed dozens of men to perform agricultural labor maintaining a gentleman's estate, now spent enormous sums recreating a romanticized version of the rural Michigan he had once fled, now played at being a country squire on weekends while operating one of the world's largest industrial operations during the week, never apparently recognizing the contradiction, never seeing that Fair Lane represented the very thing he claimed to despise, inherited wealth's pastoral fantasy, the rich man's delusion that you could have the aesthetic pleasures of rural life without the economic struggles, that you could enjoy nature without being subject to it, that you could own the land without having to work it. The powerhouse, built into a hillside near the Rouge River and designed to look like a carriage house from the outside, was perhaps the feature that most excited Ford, that most reflected his identity as an engineer and innovator. He insisted on generating Fair Lane's electricity from a hydroelectric plant powered by the river, making the estate energy self-sufficient, proving that modern technology could work in harmony with nature, that progress didn't require ugliness or pollution, that a proper application of engineering principles could solve any problem, and Ford spent countless hours in the powerhouse, more time than he spent in many rooms of the mansion, tinkering with the generators and turbines, explaining the system to visitors with obvious pride, finding in this functional space a comfort that the mansion's formal rooms never provided, because the powerhouse was honest in a way the main house wasn't. It was clearly a machine building, its purpose was undisguised, it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, and Ford, for all his contradictions, always felt most at ease with machines, most himself when surrounded by engines and gears and tangible mechanical problems that had definite solutions, unlike the social and moral and political problems he increasingly faced, unlike the questions about labor relations and corporate responsibility and the human cost of industrial progress that didn't have simple engineering solutions, that couldn't be fixed by making a better machine or a more efficient process, that required precisely the kind of nuanced thinking and willingness to compromise and acknowledgement of complexity that Ford's personality made nearly impossible. Clara Ford, throughout the planning and construction of Fair Lane, remained her husband's greatest defender and most important humanizing influence, the person who reminded him to be kind when his temper flared, who smoothed over social situations his bluntness created, who maintained relationships with family and friends that Henry's eccentricities might otherwise have destroyed, who created within Fair Lane's walls a genuine home rather than just a showcase, who filled the rooms with warmth and hospitality, who insisted that despite their wealth they would remain approachable and grounded, who never forgot where they came from even as the distance between their origins and their circumstances grew ever larger, and yet Clara's role also reveals the limitations and compromises that wealth imposed on even the most decent people, because Clara must have known about the sociological department's invasions of workers' privacy, must have been aware of the violence at the River Rouge plant, must have read or at least heard about the Dearborn Independent's anti-Semitic articles, must have witnessed her husband's psychological torture of their son Edsel, must have seen all of this and remained silent, remained loyal, remained complicit, not because she was cruel or bigoted herself. By all accounts Clara was personally kind and generous, genuinely concerned for others' welfare, but because she had made the calculation, conscious or unconscious, that her loyalty to Henry superseded any obligation to oppose his wrongs, that being a good wife meant supporting her husband even when he was wrong, that the benefits of their position, the security, the comfort, the ability to be generous to family and friends, the respect they received in their community, outweighed the costs paid by others, and this is perhaps the most insidious effect of great wealth. Not that it necessarily makes people evil but that it makes their goodness selective, allows them to be genuinely kind to those within their circle while ignoring or justifying harms to those outside it, lets them do charity to salve their consciences while participating in systems of exploitation, turns moral consideration into something that can be extended or withheld depending on personal relationship rather than something owed to all humans equally. Fair Lane was completed in 1915, though, completed, is perhaps too strong a word for a house that Ford would continue to modify and tinker with for the next 3 decades, adding rooms and features and technologies, changing things that didn't work exactly as he wanted, imposing his will on the structure the same way he imposed it on his company and his family. But 1915 marked the point when the house became habitable, when Henry and Clara moved in with their son Edsel, then 21 years old and already working at Ford Motor Company, already caught between his father's expectations and his own very different temperament, already beginning the slow psychological torture that would characterize his entire adult life, and the image of the Ford family moving into their palace at the height of Henry's triumph, at the moment when he was the most admired industrialist in America, when the Model T had become ubiquitous and the $5 day had made him a working-class hero, when his fortune was growing faster than he could count and his influence extended far beyond manufacturing into politics and culture and public discourse. This image of triumph is also the moment when we can begin to see the cracks, the ways that success was creating new problems even as it solved old ones, the ways that wealth and power were amplifying Ford's worst qualities even as they enabled his greatest achievements, the ways that Fair Lane itself, this monument to his success, would become a prison of his own making. A beautiful cage where he could hide from a world that increasingly challenged his assumptions and rejected his prejudices, where he could surround himself with people who agreed with him or at least didn't dare contradict him, where he could maintain the illusion of control even as the world beyond his gates spun out of his control. The years immediately following Fair Lane's completion were in many ways Ford's peak, the period when his reputation stood highest and his influence reached furthest, when politicians sought his advice and common people named their children after him, when he was proposed as a presidential candidate and gave interviews sharing his opinions on everything from history to nutrition to international relations, opinions that reflected his combination of genuine insight and staggering ignorance, his ability to see clearly in some areas while being utterly blind in others, his tendency to believe that success in manufacturing qualified him to pronounce judgment on matters he knew nothing about. And the tragedy is that he had a platform to spread both his wisdom and his nonsense, that people listened when he said insightful things about production efficiency and also when he said idiotic things about history, that his wealth and fame gave him authority on subjects where he had no expertise. That America in the early 20th century, like America in the early 21st, often confused business success with general competence, assumed that someone who made money must be smart about everything, gave billionaires unearned credibility simply because they were billionaires, and Fair Lane became the stage for this performance, the place where Ford received journalists and politicians and celebrities, where he played the role of wise industrialist and common man philosopher, where he could perform the character of Henry Ford that he wanted the world to see while hiding the darker aspects, the violence and paranoia and bigotry, that were increasingly defining who he actually was. The Dearborn Independent, Ford's newspaper purchase in 1919, represented the most public and most poisonous expression of the prejudices that had always lurked beneath Ford's populism, the paranoid conviction that a Jewish conspiracy controlled international finance and manipulated world events, that Jews were somehow responsible for wars and economic problems and cultural changes Ford disliked. A delusion so profound and so venomous that the Dearborn Independent, under Ford's control and with his full support, published 91 articles between 1920 and 1927 promoting these conspiracy theories, articles with titles like, The International Jew, The World's Problem, and Jewish Exploitation of Farmer Organizations, and Does Jewish Power Control the World Press, articles that were collected and published as a 4-volume set called, The International Jew, that was translated into multiple languages and distributed worldwide, that was praised by Adolf Hitler, who kept Ford's portrait in his office and cited him in Mein Kampf, that influenced Nazi ideology and provided American validation for European antisemitism, that may have helped make the Holocaust intellectually and morally possible by giving hatred the veneer of respectable opinion, and through all of this, Ford lived at Fair Lane, ate dinner with Clara, worked in his gardens, played with his grandchildren when Edsel started having children, lived a life of domestic tranquility while his newspaper spread poison, never apparently connecting his comfortable life to the hatred he was spreading, never considering that his words had consequences, never imagining, or perhaps never caring, that he was giving credibility and support to forces that would eventually murder millions. Ford only retracted the Dearborn Independent's anti-Semitic content in 1927, after years of boycotts and lawsuits and public pressure, after the damage had been done and the ideas had spread and the reputation had been established, and even then the retraction was clearly pragmatic rather than sincere, a recognition that anti-Semitism was hurting his business rather than a genuine acknowledgement that he had been wrong, that he had spread lies, that he had caused real harm to real people, and this inability to truly reckon with what he had done, this tendency to see the retraction as a business decision rather than a moral obligation, reveals something essential about Fair Lane's meaning. It was a place where consequences didn't penetrate, where Ford could insulate himself from the results of his actions, where he could live comfortably regardless of the suffering his policies caused, where wealth created a barrier between action and consequence, between choice and accountability, where he could be personally kind to his family and neighbors while being systemically cruel to workers and minorities, and this separation, this ability to compartmentalize, to live well while doing wrong, is perhaps wealth's most dangerous feature, more dangerous than the inequality it creates or the power it concentrates, because it allows the wealthy to maintain their self-image as good people even as they support and benefit from systems of oppression, allows them to be generous in person, while being ruthless in policy, allows them to love their families while exploiting other people's families, allows them to build beautiful homes while their workers live in slums, and never see the contradiction, never feel the guilt, never make the connection between their comfort and others' suffering. Edsel Ford's tragedy unfolded slowly within Fair Lane's walls and the offices of Ford Motor Company, a death by 1,000 cuts administered by a father who loved his son but couldn't stop trying to control him, couldn't accept that Edsel had different tastes and different ideas, couldn't tolerate any suggestion that his own judgment might be flawed. And so Henry systematically undermined Edsel's authority even after making him company president in 1919, would countermand his decisions, would humiliate him in front of subordinates, would keep Harry Bennett, a violent thug who ran Ford's security operations and who represented everything ugly about Ford's labor relations, close and empowered specifically because Edsel hated him, would reject Edsel's design ideas for new models even when they were clearly superior to Henry's preferences, would dismiss Edsel's concerns about quality control and labor relations and competition from General Motors and Chrysler, would treat his own son with a cruelty that shocked even people accustomed to Ford's autocratic style, and Edsel, caught between loyalty to his father and responsibility to the company, between love and self-respect, between the privileges of his position and the powerlessness of his situation, endured it all with quiet dignity that only seemed to enrage Henry more, as if Edsel's refusal to fight back was itself a form of insubordination, as if his patience and reasonableness were insults to Henry's authority, and when Edsel died in 1943, officially of stomach cancer but really of accumulated stress and humiliation and psychological torment, Henry was reportedly devastated, apparently unable to understand that he had caused his son's death as surely as if he had poisoned him, unable to connect his treatment of Edsel to Edsel's illness, unable to see that his need for control had killed the person he claimed to love most, and this inability to see, this failure of self-awareness even in the face of ultimate tragedy, is Fairlane's final meaning. It's a monument to the ways that power and wealth can make people blind to their own cruelty, can let them destroy what they love while believing they're protecting it, can turn strength into weakness and success into failure and victory into defeat, can make a palace into a tomb. Henry Ford died at Fairlane on April 7, 1947, during a flood that knocked out the estate's electrical power, died by candlelight in the house he had built to showcase modern technology, and there's a bitter poetry in that, in the man who electrified America dying in darkness, in the man who revolutionized industrial power dying when his personal power failed, in the builder of Fairlane's sophisticated hydroelectric system dying when that system couldn't function, as if even the machines he trusted more than people had finally abandoned him, as if the universe itself was delivering a judgment on his life's meaning, and when Clara died 3 years later, Fairlane passed to the Ford Motor Company and eventually to the University of Michigan Dearborn, and for decades it languished, was neglected, fell into disrepair, its roof leaked and its walls cracked and its gardens grew wild and its powerhouse fell silent, and the university, apparently unsure what to do with this complicated legacy, this beautiful house built by a man who was simultaneously hero and villain, genius and bigot, revolutionary and reactionary, mostly ignored it, let it decay, let it become a ruin, until finally in recent years there's been a restoration effort, an attempt to preserve Fairlane and tell its story, and the question that effort raises is, what story do we tell? Do we celebrate Ford's genius and ignore his cruelty? Do we condemn his bigotry and dismiss his achievements? Do we try to hold both truths simultaneously, to acknowledge that this beautiful house was built by a complicated man whose legacy includes both revolutionary progress and appalling harm, whose fortune came from both genuine innovation and systematic exploitation, who gave America wheels but also gave it assembly line dehumanization, who raised wages but also created industrial surveillance, who built Fairlane but also built a system of labor relations based on violence and fear, and if we can hold all of that, if we can resist the temptation to simplify, then maybe Fairlane can finally become what it always should have been, not a celebration of one man's triumph but a meditation on the price of progress, not a monument to American industrial genius but a question about what we're willing to sacrifice for material advancement, not a palace but a mirror, showing us not just Henry Ford's contradictions but our own, not just the early 20th century's compromises but our own, not just one wealthy man's ability to live comfortably while his workers suffered but our own willingness to benefit from systems of exploitation we'd rather not examine, and maybe that's Fairlane's ultimate value, not as inspiration but as warning, not as something to emulate but as something to reckon with, not as proof that American capitalism rewards merit but as evidence of how much human cost that system can inflict and still call itself success.